Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Now the topic for today is actually Tasha's Cauldron of Everything Leaked Analysis. That's my title. So there have been a lot of leaked material presented. I don't know if you know, but Tasha's Cauldron of Everything got leaked on Fantasy Grounds for a period of time. And as a result of that, a lot of people were able to access it and took screenshots. As they were taking screenshots, they then uploaded it to another website, then made it available to a lot of people so they could check out the information. Which means the information they selected and the screenshots they picked were really about the stuff they were most interested in. So it's not everything, it's only a sample, I guess. You might say the bits that people were most interested in. Then on top of that, because like anything with any new good book, we've got the problem that as a result of all that nonsense, somebody has clearly taken the book, scanned it or had a PDF, then downloaded that PDF onto some very dodgy websites. So if you want to download a PDF of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and I never suggest that you pirate because you shouldn't, you could, but you do so at your own risk. I did not download them because I did not want spyware running through my computer, and I certainly didn't want all sorts of viruses being attached and attacking my computer system, which is probably what's going to happen if you try to download the free PDFs that are available for Tasha's Cauldron for Everything. So I don't recommend doing that. What I will say is if you look down in the description, you will find a number of links to documents that are not risky, that have information on Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. There's a Google Doc, there are a couple of mere sort of screenshots in there, and there's an article that just got released by I can't even remember what it was, a GameSpot, that's right, GameSpot. So they released a little bit more additional information just today as far as I can tell, which you might find really useful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize most of my content for today because there's so much information, and although I do want to go into detail to a certain degree with some stuff, I want to do that at the tail end of this video rather than the front end. So I'm front loading the summary rather than putting it at the end. I know that sounds strange, but I think that's going to work probably better for all of you. What I want to make clear is when I'm doing this, it's from my perspective, okay? Like all videos on YouTube, you need to understand that it's going to be from my perspective rather than from somebody else's perspective. I can't talk to somebody else's opinion of something, but I can talk to my own opinion from what I see. This book, as far as I can tell, is going to significantly change the way we play Dungeons and Dragons 5e. And I know a lot of people think that I am kidding when I say this, but I'm serious. I'm very, very serious that what we're looking at is a complete change in the way Dungeons and Dragons 5e runs. And I know people are going to say, well, but Fred, you have forgotten that as a result of all of this, this is just material. You don't have to use it. It's all optional stuff. You do not need to use anything in this. Now, what we know, if you are a dungeon master, it's not always going to work that way. Sometimes a dungeon master will have leeway and understanding players, and they can make things optional. And in other times, it's not. And if you're playing in Dungeons and Dragons Adventurers League, which really I feel like this book is built for, but it's also a response to something else, which I will discuss very shortly. So the first thing I want to sort of go through is the first part of the Google Doc that is provided on what we know about Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Okay, it's coming out November the 17th, 2020, but really that's for the United States. North America will get it. The rest of you aren't going to see it till sometime in December. Now they're saying December 1st, but that could be much later. So if you're in Europe or any other part of the world, you're going to be waiting a bit longer. That's just a reality. The book is 192 pages, thank God for that. It's still a relatively large book. It's not as big as some of the campaign settings or adventures that have been released, understandable. They have 4 chapters covering character options, which is by far probably the largest area, spells, magic items, group patrons, tools for dungeon masters, And then you've got sort of a chapter that, well, no, actually, that's it. That pretty much covers that. Okay, the other thing I would like to say is that Tasha's Cauldron to Everything does something that I was not expecting to see at this point. It actually changes the usefulness of Dungeons & Dragons 5e. So it's not all bad, for those of you who were wondering. It is optional, of course, as I said. There is one other thing I would like to say, and that is there's a lot of reprints, okay? Yes, you have at least all 13 classes are in here, okay? All 13 are in this book, essentially. So if you're playing Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League, that means you can access the Player's Handbook and Tasha's Cauldron to Everything, and realistically, you've got access to everything you might want or need, as it happens. There are 22 new subclasses. There are 5 reprints, which frankly, and some of these reprints have actually appeared in books this year, which I think is kind of ridiculous. I'm not going to go through all of the subclasses that are included as reprints, because I have actually listed all of the subclasses down in the description, and you're welcome to go and check those out. But they are there, okay, and it's in the Google document itself. None of this has not appeared in Unearthed Arcana. One of the things you might want to consider is they're saying that these are the subclasses and options that got the highest satisfaction scores in the Unearthed Arcana surveys. Okay, so when they were playtesting it, those people who bothered to actually fill in the survey and look at the material and have something to say about it are the ones that really steered how the game is going to operate. So that's one thing to understand. So it's not necessarily that this is what the general population that play Dungeons & Dragons want. It's just those people who bothered to fill in the survey. So if you've got a vested interest, then you're more likely to say yes or no to things that you like or want to keep, whatever your motivations might be, okay? Just to make it clear to you. There are definitely a whole lot of variant options in here, and pretty much everything gets powered up in some way. Okay, so now that we've sort of covered that, and I want to sort of talk about the bits and pieces in this book that, for me, make it interesting as a problem as a dungeon master, not just in Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League, but as a home dungeon master as well, because I tend to do a lot of my stuff at home rather than somewhere else. As I said, this book will fundamentally change how you play it. Now, how is it going to fundamentally change it? I'm going to explain. This book is absolutely jam-packed with flexible variant rules for dungeon masters, which dungeon masters can sign off on or not sign off on, depending on what they want to do, absolutely. And by far, the book is full of the best player character options you'll see in the game. So all of the best stuff, as far as I can tell, apart from maybe the Hex Blade for the Warlock, is in this book. That says quite a lot. If everything that is the best to have is in one book, pretty much, then this book is essentially sort of almost required for anybody playing the game, which is a little bit odd, but it'll drive sales, and I guess that's how companies stay open, is to make sure they make content that people want to see, which is understandable. This book is designed for players to give them more options, and would have to say it's steered more towards players than dungeon masters, in my opinion. It is also very much built around the structure and organisation for organised play, or Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League. Adventurers League games actually restrict how many books you can use when creating a character. The current restriction, I believe, and has been for some time, is you get 2 source books. So now they can use the Player's Handbook and Xanathar's Guide to Everything, or the Player's Handbook and Tasha's Cauldron to Everything. But they can't use the Player's Handbook, Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and Tasha's Cauldron to Everything. They can only use 2. Adventurers League players are going to be hounding Wizards of the Coast and the organised play system to be able to use 3 books. I can see that happening for sure. It's a no-brainer. It's going to happen. We're going to see it. and it's only a matter of time before I think Wizards of the Coast reneges on it and says, okay, fair enough, you can have it. So just to be warned, for those of you who are playing Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League, I think life is going to look pretty good for you. Now, what about if you're running a home game? What's that going to look like to you? Okay, so first off, home games, yes, the Dungeon Master is going to be able to make a decision about whether they have it or not. But I can guarantee you, it doesn't matter what table you're sitting at. The vast majority of players are going to apply pressure to the Dungeon Master to be able to have access to the Player's Handbook, of course, which they should, Tasha's Cauldron to everything, and Xanathar's Guide to everything. Okay, that is more than likely the go-to when it comes to character creation now. Even if you say no to stuff, there is going to be significant pressure by players to be able to have that. So what do you do about that? Well, everybody's going to have to manage that their own way. But I want to warn you now, that is most certainly likely to happen. Okay, I want to now summarize the new subclasses and what I see. And then I'll come back to them and discuss them individually after I've done everything else. So I'm working through the Google document backwards, you might say. The first thing I noticed with regard to this and these subclasses is almost everything is overpowered with a lot of power creep. I mean, overall, almost all of the classes have been improved in some way, whether you use a different subclass from a different book. But probably the best subclasses are sitting in Tasha's Cauldron to everything. That's what I noticed. The other thing I noticed, and that is concerning, was that there are by far the worst wording. The wording for some of these class features is awful. And there's going to be a lot of people asking for clarification through sage advice, and there's going to be a lot of confusion. I can see that for sure. I can also see a return to what I see as Dungeons & Dragons 4E mechanics. Now, it's not completely like that, but it feels like it, it smells like that. It reminds me of some of the game mechanics we had when we were using Dungeons & Dragons 4E, and I feel like they've sort of tried to move them into Dungeons & Dragons 5e. There are some very strange features that are narratively quite silly within this book. The age of the tentacle character is coming. Like, there's a lot of tentacles in these character classes. By far, some of the worst snowflake subclasses galore, just rife right throughout the whole thing. It is, if you like multi-classing, it is a multi-classing gold mine for gamers. Literally, I can see so many people being able to dip into subclasses because a lot of them are front-loaded. Not all of them, but quite a few, some of the better ones, are actually front-loaded, which means you only need to take 1 or 2 levels to get what you want out of it, and then leave the rest and move on to something else. It is very rare that you'll see one sort of feature that appears at level 3, because most people, when they are multi-classing, don't want to pick up a dip of 3 levels. 1 or 2 levels is the preferred. Otherwise, you know, there are disadvantages to multi-classing, but if you do it right and do it well, you're probably going to have a better character than somebody else. Does anybody remember what used to happen when we were playing Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 and Dungeons & Dragons 4E, and there's a lot of flying characters that are invisible? Well, there are a lot of flying character classes in here with no concentration, which means we're going to return to, we're now flying, no concentration, and now we can get invisibility cast on us, so we're invisible and flying at the same time. New people will struggle with the learning curve to deal with all of this, because if they don't figure out how to use these books and these options, more experienced players are really going to leave them behind. So I can see it's hard enough to get your head around the player's handbook when you start out, but then to suddenly have 3 books that you're pulling from, and Tasha's Cauldron to Everything is definitely one of those books you're going to have to sort of delve into at some point. This is the age of the mega superhero in Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Not just the superhero, but the mega superhero. it's very much a response, I feel and believe, to the competition that has been created from the roleplay game Pathfinder, the second version, not the first version, because a lot of people were getting dissatisfied with the original Pathfinder when Dungeons & Dragons 5e came out, but then a lot of people are, particularly those who like the number crunching, the power gaming, the min-maxing, and the customization, are returning to Pathfinder Ed Edition 2 rather than playing Dungeons & Dragons 5e because of all the things they can do with that. Just to let you know, I'm definitely sure that that is what's going on here. Okay. Now that we've said that, I'm working my way backwards through the Google document, and I'm going to start with the Sidekick Rules, which I like probably the most out of everything in the entire book. Why do I like it? Well, it's good for small groups of players. If you have a small group of players, you don't have enough players, you need to build up and at least have 4 or 5 in your group so you can actually get through the campaign, rather than the Dungeon Master having to adjust everything because you're not quite as resilient when it comes to combat, and the chance of one person going down could potentially lead to the entire party getting wiped out. Then this is the go-to. It was presented in the Dungeons & Dragons Essentials kit for the Dragon of Icespire Peak. I've used them. It's a good idea. I love it. It can also be used by a Dungeon Master as an NPC or non-player character, or even minions. And it's easy to build, easy to adjust, and actually really easy to use compared to trying to use character classes. Or even try to use a monster stat block, which is usually not nearly as powerful as the player's characters. Okay, that's usually the reality. So Dungeon Masters always find themselves having to adjust monster stat blocks so they're more in line to make that work. You could actually have an entire party full of sidekicks. Little companions are not just companions now. If you really wanted to, the entire group could just skip using the player characters options that are available in the player's handbook and just use the sidekick rules. I could see that working. I think this is very much intended to get new players who are really struggling with the complexity of Dungeons & Dragons 5e and need something simpler. I know people are saying that Dungeons & Dragons 5e is already very simple, but there are some people who will struggle with it and they need something a bit more simple, and this will do it. And you could literally just do that. So just to understand that, full classes are still more complicated and harder to play than a sidekick, I can assure you. It also will allow those people who have kids to actually get the younger kids playing the game, because they could play a sidekick rather than a full fleshed out player character, rather than using the character classes. And I don't know if anybody noticed, but the sidekicks, the rules around it allow for you to have a challenge rating half monster or creature. And there's a lot of really cool and insane creatures that you could use if you wanted to with regard to the sidekick rules. And would you believe it, a jackalwere is an option, a rust monster, and I could go on. I believe you could have a grey ooze if you wanted to as a sidekick. You could even be a grey ooze if you were to play the sidekick as your character. I know it sounds a bit crazy, but this is where we're going. I don't think that's a bad thing really, but I just want to make you aware. The jackalwere is the one that I am the most concerned about. Now, why am I concerned about something like that? I'm concerned roughly because what you're dealing with is a creature that is really hard to kill. They have the same sort of attributes of most were creatures, and it's a really low creature. It's CR half, so you could use it. That wouldn't be hard to do at all. Yes, you need to believe me, I'm serious. You could literally do that, not a problem. The other thing is, does anybody remember the background, the knight? It's a variant, right? It's a variant background you could use. And this variant background definitely is going to benefit by having access to something like the sidekicks. Now, probably the most surprising thing about the use of sidekicks in Dungeons & Dragons 5e is it will essentially negate the necessity to have a Dungeons & Dragons 6th Ed edition. If you're worried about them pumping out another version of Dungeons and Dragons anytime soon, I think it's totally unnecessary now because of sidekicks. Because really the only thing they really needed to do if they were to put out another game was to make it simpler to get more people playing the game and more people buying their books and their products. And this does it. It doesn't simplify the core rules. There are still things like readying an action, opportunity attacks, bonus actions, which always confuses people. Things like those sorts of things. They make it a little bit more stodgy. You know, concentration. That's all hard stuff for new people to get their head around. So it doesn't break away the core rules, but that's actually probably a lot easier to actually adjust if you needed to, rather than adjusting the character classes, because the character classes is really where things are hard to manage at times. And then of course we move on to spells, and that's a different issue in itself. Okay, so that's my view on the sidekicks, for those of you who are wondering what my opinion was. It's a good thing. The next one is the group patrons. I was really hoping to see something significant here, something that would sort of set it apart from everything else, and I don't feel like we've got that, because I feel like the group patrons should have been printed in the player's handbook right back in 2014. It is something that people have probably been doing for some time, realizing that it would be sensible to have everybody linked to a particular patron to make sure they are goal focused as a group rather than individually focused, which tends to be the norm now in modern Dungeons and Dragons 5e games, is people want to have their own individual quests and own individual storyline, which is fine, but Dungeons and Dragons is a group game, and really the focus, whether it's a different reason for doing something than somebody else, it should still meet at some point at the same point and have the same goal ultimately. So most of the 9 patrons, I looked through them and I thought they were quite boring. Frankly, I didn't like them. The only one that I thought was interesting was the Lich. And why is that? Because I didn't think of it. Frankly, it did not occur to me. But then again, if you're dealing with a Lich and the players are using that as their patron, then the party's probably evil, and that runs into a whole lot of other issues that, frankly, most people don't need to deal with. You know, that'll create a whole lot of hassles for people, guaranteed. I'm sure of it. Now, I know there are people out there who can run an evil campaign and they will be fine, but most of us can't do that with the people we have, because either they're not capable of managing it, or we're not experienced enough as dungeon masters to pull it off. Now, I'm speaking from my own perspective, and I've been doing this quite a long time, and for some strange reason I was stupid enough to actually start a YouTube channel and try to help people play the game, so I must know something, right? The other thing is, most of the patrons are actually reprinted from the Aberrant book, and if they're not reprinted directly, they just look like they have simply changed the wording of the actual title, but it's simply the same thing. So we're not really getting anything new. We've already had it in a different book. The group patrons have lore behind them, which I think is fantastic. This is the part I like the most, okay? But the group patrons have lore and mechanical benefits that will actually increase the power of your characters and the group ultimately, which means you've got to adjust all your monsters. So we're introducing power creep yet again. And I know people say, well, that's not a big deal, but there are so many things that introduce power creep, and every time you do this, you have to readjust things. It really sort of makes the Dungeons and Dragons monster manual for 5e almost useless to you, because you're going to have to make so many alterations, or push out the challenge rating to a lot higher. You know, challenge rating never was any good anyway, but you know what I mean. Here's the other thing is, groups could have actually created the lore and fluff themselves without ever having this in a book. All of us, if you look at what there is, they're not super interesting. They're not really right out there, nothing new. It's all been done before. The idea of the group patron, as I said, is a great idea. It's awesome. It should be there. It should have been in the Dungeon Master's Guide and in the Player's Handbook, and it's not. But now it also requires consensus amongst all of your players. Can anybody imagine trying to get all of their players to actually agree on the same patron? I can assure you I've seen that happen in my home game, and it doesn't always work out the way you might expect. Okay? So I just want to make it clear that getting consensus from all the players to agree on the same patron might actually be quite difficult. If it does work out, it's by far the most enjoyable experience to have a group patron where everybody is agreeing on what they should be doing and where they will go next, and they're all connected in some way. It's great. So the only reason I feel the group patrons have a mechanical benefit is that the designers probably sort of sat there and thought, well, if we just present group patrons with just fluff and lore and an idea, sort of like a narrative or a story idea, and only that, there's probably going to be a lot of players and groups who just aren't interested. So we have to give them a carrot. We have to sell the idea to them, and the only way to sell that idea with group patrons is to give them a mechanical benefit. And I think that's what they were trying to do with this game, is they were trying to give them a mechanical benefit so that they would be on board. Your players will be on board to use it. Because why would you not be on board if you get something extra out of it? That makes actually quite a lot of sense. So I wanted to point that out to you because it is by far the simplest and most useful idea that you could have in your game, but selling it to your players is often quite difficult, which is why they have married the idea of a benefit of some kind. Okay, so let's talk about the next aspect, which is your natural hazards. I was really disappointed by this section. Frankly, I thought, that these people sit around all day doing stuff. So that means they must know what they are doing, right? That's all they do, is they just sit around and think up ideas and test things. So if they can do that, natural hazard should be really good, right? The only natural hazard I saw that I thought was any good was the avalanche. That was it. The rest of them were really crappy. Frankly, I didn't like them. I thought they were a cop-out. It looks like a second thought by the Dungeons & Dragons crew. I feel like they needed to fill up the book with more Dungeon Master stuff so that Dungeon Masters would want to buy this book, because frankly it's really designed more around the players than the Dungeon Masters, which is fine, this is going to happen. And they thought, well, we don't have a lot on natural hazards, let's put something out there. And really it was half-baked as far as I'm concerned. So now I want to give you an example of why I think that's the case. If you have a look at the table of contents, which has been leaked, it's available, you can get it, you'll notice that there's no earthquakes, there's no floods, there's no volcanic eruptions, no storms, no blizzard. Now, there is the magical storm, which you might say kind of fills the same purpose. Maybe it does. And yes, the current book that just recently came out, Rime of the Frost Maiden, should have information on dealing with a blizzard. But it's not in this book, right? Rock and mudslides, not there. Quicksand, tar pits, and a forest fire. None of which is actually there. I am not trying to turn you off from buying the book. For those of you who think that I'm going to hit this thing and say you shouldn't buy it because it's not worth your money. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I want to say is if you are hoping to get a good collection of natural hazards, you're not going to get that because it's not in the book. Okay, just to make it clear. All right, I was really excited by the idea of magical phenomena and locations. I thought that was a really nice thing to add into the book. I was really excited. Then I looked at what they had, and it's yet again very limited and pretty bad. It doesn't really cover the things I was expecting. I consider this lightweight fantasy, When you think of magical phenomena and locations and stuff that might be really interesting that you want to pluck and put into your home campaign or a pre-made campaign, you're really looking for something that jumps out and excites your players and you, right? Did anybody notice that the concept behind magic mushrooms is pretty dodgy? It's not just dodgy, it's something that we could have come up with. Super Mario Magic Mushroom Land, okay, it's not a big stretch, but I can feel that it's going to wind up going down the dodgy lane. The other thing is, did anybody notice that there's no information on fairy rings? Fairy rings are actually missing. It's a very standard mythology when it comes to the Fae and fantasy, is the concept of the fairy ring, and we do not have that. What I do like is the mimic colony. I really like the mimic colony. Now, I know somebody was saying to me, one of my friends was saying, yeah, but here's the problem. The mimics are just going to eat everybody. Well, apparently you can live inside a mimic and have little mimics around you and they're all fine. So maybe there's a point where mimics can do more than just be eating machines. So I liked that aspect. I thought that was probably the most interesting idea out there. And I would never have come up with the idea of having a mimic colony. And I have literally run games where I had a wizard tower that was a giant mimic, a giant ancient mimic. Everything inside the tower was a mimic. So I like mimics. And so my head's around that. But they came up with this idea, which I didn't. And I thought that was worth mentioning. It's a really good idea. Then we go to the supernatural regions. It's not very exciting. The only thing that kind of interests me is the Far Realm, because when you look at books and try to find out any kind of information about the Far Realm, there's really nothing talked about. Nobody really talks about the Far Realm. It's just a place that nobody knows very much about, and that's it. So, given that, I was again somewhat disappointed with that part of the material. Now, puzzles. I want to talk briefly about the puzzles that are included in here, because I thought it was quite an interesting. I thought this was a good development, something that should have happened. We should have had puzzles a long time ago. So it's definitely a nice idea for people who like puzzles. If you don't like puzzles, obviously you're not going to like them. There are 14 puzzles. One has been previewed already. We've already seen one of those puzzles. But it's extremely hard to solve. It's actually quite difficult to solve. And if you watch a channel called Wally DM, he recently did a video presenting this puzzle and then explaining how to make it a bit easier so the players can actually solve it. So if this is what we get from the very first preview of a puzzle, what is going to happen when we see the rest of the puzzles? Because constructing puzzles that work for your group, that are simple enough but also taxing enough that they are interesting and get everybody on board, is actually extremely difficult to do. Okay, it's far more difficult than any other part of the game, which is probably why I don't use puzzles very much. I know there are lots of groups that do, but that's a really difficult skill to achieve. Did you realize too that when you make a mistake with a puzzle, there's usually a consequence that people don't like? And as a result of that, people tend to avoid puzzles because of that. It will certainly appeal to some people, but not everybody in a group. So my current group, for example, consists of a bunch of nerds. There are probably maybe 2 people that I can think of that like puzzles. And the other half of the group, or more than half, don't like puzzles. They find them quite difficult, and so they wouldn't like them. So I can see puzzles generating arguments amongst your players. But if you have a group where everybody's on board and loves solving puzzles together, it is a very useful resource. Although I still feel like you're probably better to go and check out Wally DM's Journal of Puzzle Encounters. Okay, I've talked about the topic before. That is mint puzzle material. Absolutely the best. This is also a return, as it happens, I would say, to older forms of Dungeons and Dragons play, where there were puzzles included. And we haven't really seen puzzles in Dungeons and Dragons 5e, and this is probably trying to reintroduce that, which is actually quite a good idea. Okay, so lots of good stuff there, certainly for some people who will enjoy that sort of thing. Now, I don't want to say too much about, frankly, I don't want to say too much about parlaying with monsters, because I feel like a table that gives you sort of monster reactions, it's not mechanics, not that we really needed that, you know, dealing with monsters should be narrative, in my opinion. I know a lot of people will want a mechanical aspect to it, but they don't get that in this book. The other thing is the tables feel a little bit like the tables we used to have where, and I don't know for sure, where you might roll on the table and they are friendly, indifferent, aggressive, hostile, or they attack. You know, these are the sort of responses you might get from a monster, and you sort of roll on the thing, and that's how they respond to the player's characters, which is fine. Okay, but I still feel like it's a bit of a waste of time. I feel like it was just chucked in there to sort of fill up space a bit. The other thing is Session 0. Now, Session 0, I'm a big proponent of Session 0. I think they are a great idea. They should be done. Certainly not very useful for a one-shot, but if you're running a campaign, absolutely. But the Session 0 information should have been in the Dungeon Master's Guide, not in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. And if you don't notice, if you look on the contents page, I've actually seen the page that has the section on Session 0, but I'm not going to show it to you. I don't think it was through a site that is legit. So this got leaked. The other thing didn't get leaked, okay? And I haven't presented it anywhere. But it's very short. It's like one page. And I'm not even sure if it's a complete page at that. So it's a very short section. It's not very extensive from what I could make out. But it's a great idea, a great topic, but there's not enough of it to be really useful to people. So a lost opportunity. I do feel like a lot of the material for the Dungeon Master was a second thought rather than the main focus for this book. For those of you who are wondering how useful it will be to you as a Dungeon Master. So now let's start talking about the magic tattoos. Magic tattoos, these are trendy, okay? And I want to make it clear that the intention behind the magic tattoo is to replace a magic item. So rather than getting a magic item, you get a magic tattoo. But it doesn't really replace a magic item, because I can guarantee you that even if players get a magic tattoo, they're still going to want the magic item as well. Okay, that might not be the case for every group, but I do feel like that's definitely going to be the group in most cases. Okay, particularly if you're playing in Dungeons and Dragons Adventurers League. Now you can stock up on tattoos and magic items, and the great thing about a magic tattoo is people can't steal the magic item off you because it's a tattoo. It's attached to your body. You can't lose it. Will you be able to actually trade a magic tattoo to somebody else if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons Adventurers League? Are there going to be rules around doing that? That's a question that needs to be answered at some point. I kind of wonder how that's going to work. There's certainly a power boost for the characters and the monsters, so you could put magic tattoos for you, those of you who are Dungeon Masters, not just players. Players can put these magic tattoos on their characters, but Dungeon Masters, you can put these magic tattoos on your monsters. And most of them appear to be making your character or monster more powerful. So they're an advantage rather than a disadvantage. I didn't think they were very interesting. I felt that it was trendy, it was fashion. It's fashionable now to have tattoos, and so they have included magic tattoos for that very purpose. I would have also liked to see some of the tattoos be cursed, or at least a few more that had that feeling of being cursed. Does anybody remember Curse of the Azure Bonds? A very old game, and basically this tattoo meant that somebody could control your actions, and it was a curse, and you couldn't take it off because it had been magically imbued into your skin, and it spawned a really good story. I feel like cursed tattoos could certainly drive and make a really good story. And there are a whole bunch of them in the Google document for those of you who are unsure about where I'm getting all the information from. Down in the description, you will find all the information that has been leaked. Okay, so that's the magic tattoos. Let's get on to the magic items. I've never been a huge fan of magic items, but I know a lot of people like them, which is understandable. So the big talking point is the demonicon. The demonicon. Yeah, it is. Demonicon. It's the demon book. It's the big focus right now, is that particular item, because it's the only one that's really been released with any kind of information behind it. So you kind of know what it's going to be able to do. Not a lot, mostly picture and sort of a brief overview, okay? But it's the big talking point. Clearly incredibly powerful. And almost all magic items in here look very powerful. I don't know the final write-up and quirks behind every single one, but usually magic items present more power rather than less. And you're adding more of them in. I feel like magic items are a bit of a trap for dungeon masters that players gravitate towards, because you can't say, I mean, the designer said Dungeons & Dragons 5e is light on magic items. They're rare. You don't find that many of them. And then we have a rarity, you know. Some are common, uncommon, some are more rare than others, and so forth. And essentially, even though the design team was trying to present the idea that you didn't get that many magic items, players don't think that way. So you get the wish list, and there's a bunch of them on there that I can see getting added to the wish list for players to put on their characters. And a lot of them are quite cheesy and pointless, because really you can't sort of just get the magic item you want. It's something you usually find. We don't have magic stores where you can go and buy stuff. So I do feel like the magic items are not going to work out the way people think. One of the things I did notice with the magic items as I was looking through there, which I thought was quite interesting, it presented a couple of items that make a wizard even more powerful. I love playing wizards. Frankly, I really do. I love playing wizards, but there was a couple that sort of presented themselves as being even more useful than everything else. And I believe it's a book that you can use as a spell focus, and it does a whole bunch of things. It improves your save DC and attacks. So if you're casting spells of an attack, it's going to improve them. +1, +2, +3. And then there's other classes that get something quite similar to that. Maybe not exactly the same, but did the wizard really need to have anything more powerful? So that's an item that I would say to you is you probably want to steer away from, because it's going to cause an awful lot of trouble for you. Now that I've had a big sort of unload on magic items, so I know people love magic items, because look, if you're going to introduce these magic items, try to give them a story reason for being there, okay? So that they don't present too many of them, because there's a lot of magic items in there that are going to just break the game. And the details around them aren't finalized yet, so we'll know more about them very, very shortly. And they keep dropping more and more information, little breadcrumbs for people as they get more and more excited about the release of the book. Okay, let's talk about feats. Now, there's been discussions about the feats in this book already. And what's a little odd is these feats are a mixed bag. Some of them are quite silly, some of them are very strong, and some of them are pointless. But it also seems like it's trying to multi-class. It's almost like your character is now multi-classing without multi-classing, but on a diet. You don't get anything quite as good as multi-classing would get you, but that's sort of, I guess, beside the point. If you want to multi-class, you will. It steps on the toes. A lot of these feats actually step on the toes of other classes. Would you believe it? Why would you do that? I thought we weren't going to do that with Dungeons & Dragons 5e, but they're actually doing that in this version. And I'm going to give you an example of what I consider a feat that steps on the toes of another class. And that would be Skill Expert. Bards, rogues, well, guess what? We've got somebody who can pick up skill expert. That's a really good example of stepping on the toes of another class. Okay, metamagic adept. Oh, let's step on the toes of the sorcerer. What made the sorcerer stand out is not really going to stand out anymore. Okay. So the artificer initiate. Again, I don't really like the artificer that much myself, but let's step on the toes of a completely new class. Okay, so I don't really like these. What I did notice is that a lot of the feat ideas seem to be almost ripped out of, or borrowed or stolen, as you might like to say, from Pathfinder 2e, the new version of Pathfinder. Now, let's get real. You know, Pathfinder is really just a clone of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, but they have certainly, the newer version of Pathfinder sort of has this aspect to their feats. And I see a lot of these feats doing exactly that. On top of that, it is almost definitely a response to the competition that Pathfinder 2e is having with Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Now, I'm sure that Dungeons & Dragons 5e is still probably more popular than Pathfinder 2e. But Pathfinder 2e has drawn a lot of the player base towards it rather than staying with Dungeons & Dragons 5e. A lot of people who like to min-max and like power gaming and like the variation are being drawn to more options. And this is what some of these feats are trying to do in a very roundabout way, you might say. So that's the feats that I had to discuss in here. Now, I love playing spellcasters. Frankly, I think they're probably one of the most fun things to play in the game. And it's because they are so complicated. I actually like the complexity of spells. So for me, the spell section was a big draw, and I'm sure it will be for a lot of people. There are a lot of spells in here that are reprints. That's right. There are reprints from the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. And the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, as far as I can tell, seems to almost be ignored now. A lot of people didn't like the book. It's now not usable in Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League play, as far as I can tell, and they have transposed a couple of, pretty much all of the cantrips that people loved the most into this, such as the Lightning Lure and Green Flame Blade, Booming Blade, very, very popular. They're all transposed into this thing. But Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade have been nerfed, so you can only cast it on yourself. I know there's going to be a few people who play Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League and home games who won't like that. I can understand why they've done it, okay? And it stops them being used in ways they really weren't supposed to be used, and the designers are trying to sort of make amends to that or adjust that. So if this book is very much Dungeons & Dragons 5.5. I feel like it's very much Dungeons & Dragons 5.5. Now, when you add additional spells, and there's, I guess, not a huge number, but there's enough, you make all spellcasters better again. Spellcasters are usually pretty good, particularly the wizard, compared to a lot of the other classes that you can play. But spellcasters, because of what they can do with their spells, is usually the go-to. You know, if you have a class, it's always good to be able to cast spells as well. So now you add more spells, makes all the casters better. You can pretty much summon anything under the sun. But what they've done with the text, if they made them more specific, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It will help speed up play. It will resolve a lot of issues that people have when playing Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League, which is always a good thing too. What about Mind Sliver and Spirit Shroud? They've just been released, so we know what the exact wording is for Mind Sliver and Spirit Shroud, and it was on GameSpot. The Mind Sliver is not the same Mind Sliver we really saw before. No, it pretty much is, okay? So you could combine something like Mind Sliver with the Sorcerer, use Quicken Spell, and make sure to, whenever you cast another spell with it, you can improve the chances of a spell that has a saving throw from being successful. So let's use that in combination to improve the chance of a bigger spell that's more powerful being effective. And this is really what Mind Sliver will be used for. That's what its intention is, and it's going to be used by a lot of people. So even if they don't have a class that has access to Mind Sliver, they're going to probably multi-class to be able to get access to it, or try to find a way of getting Mind Sliver as a cantrip in their class by picking up a feat to be able to do something like that. Spirit Shroud, incredibly useful and powerful spell. Those two examples in themselves suggest to me are going to make things really interesting in terms of how to deal with spellcasters. Spellcasters already pretty hard to deal with in the game as it is. But you can summon pretty much anything under the sun. We don't know what sort of control you have over the thing that is being summoned. I haven't been able to find any information on that yet. Maybe I will later on, who knows. Chances are, though, I won't necessarily do a video on that topic because I won't have time. Okay, let's talk about the races. The races and the variant rules around the races is a huge talking point. A lot of people really like the idea. I can understand that. Having versatility, certainly when I was min-maxing my characters or trying to power game, which I'm not necessarily very good at doing, but I've tried to do it from time to time. There are a bunch of things that the variant rules around the races are going to probably do. And that is, it's going to make it more flexible. The lineage system probably makes things too flexible. You could easily have everybody change one of their skills to perception. And if you don't play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons or are not aware, something like perception is the super skill. It is the skill that pretty much gets used the most and all the time, over and over again. So being able to have proficiency in perception is always desirable. Now, the designers have said that really don't have to worry quite so much about that sort of thing. It's probably not so much an issue with regard to your backgrounds, because you could kind of adjust out your proficient skills that you gained through your background anyway before these rules came. But now you can do that before the background, and you can do that through your race selection and the variant rules around the races. So that means you've got more options available for what you can do if you don't want the stuff that is currently available in a background. Maybe the key feature is what you want in the flavor, but the skills are just things you just didn't like. So it does change things quite a lot. It is by far the most exploitable variant rule that I can see in the entire book. So we will definitely get a wider range of classes, absolutely. So if you like the idea of being able to exploit the rules and get more out of your character class through the races, you're certainly going to be able to do that with this. You're definitely going to get a wider range of classes of different races. I think that's definitely a given. It does kind of screw over the variant human. When I was looking at how it might interact with the variant human, well, what's the point? It doesn't really matter where I place my +1s, because I could do that before, so it doesn't really get anything more out of it, whereas everybody else gets something out of it, but the variant human doesn't. I'm not quite so concerned about the variant human, because it was always quite an effective and powerful sub-race anyway, and I was never very much a fan of it. But I would say this, that the half-elf gets insanely better. It makes the half-elf incredibly useful, because I can think of builds that where I've used a half-elf and I've multi-classed, and if I had the ability to do some adjustments with where I put my ability scores, improvement, and some sort of way of adjusting the skills that I picked up, but the ability, adjusting where I can put my ability score improvement is actually really useful. And with a half elf, it's going to make a big difference. It does and this is the thing that upsets me the most about this change. It does break the concept of the fantasy races. So I'm not so concerned about the psychological aspect of a race, or even the cultural aspect of a race, but very much the physiology of the races, because the physiology is very different. It's not like we're talking about humans, where we have Africans and Europeans or Asians. Physiology is a little bit different, but they're all pretty much the same. But the physiology of fantasy races is quite significantly different. And I do feel like that's going to be able to break that. You could essentially have a gnome who's extremely strong, and that doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense given their stature, and yet we're going to see that coming out. That's going to happen. And it does make the game, in terms of the races, more homogenous. You know, everything is pretty much sort of wherever. I don't like the race adjustment myself. It's not a variant rule that I'd be a fan of applying in my game. But I'm sure there will be a lot of players who will feel very differently about it, and a lot of dungeon masters who will think that this is actually perfectly fine, a reasonable way to go, and all power to you. But I do feel you'll find that it will make the races more homogenous rather than them being special. Just like a lot of the changes to the subclasses. You know, a lot of the subclasses and those feats that you have really do mean that a lot of the subclasses feel pretty much the same, because you can just pick up something else to do what you want it to do rather than having that subclass. Okay, this is where things get really detailed. I am talking for a long time, I realize. We're going to talk about wizards. I love wizards, okay? I am biased towards the wizard. I spare no bones about it. I am biased towards wizards. I love wizards. I think they are one of the most fun classes to play. I also love the monk, but we're not talking about the monk yet. Wizards. There is a bunch of reprinting. Reprinting of the bladesinging wizard from the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, because of course we want to get rid of that. The new version, it's actually an upgraded version of the bladesinging wizard, and it's better. It's better than what we saw. So it's not like we needed to make wizards better, because wizards are pretty much the strongest class in the game. They are, you know, broken really, which is part of the fun of playing them, because you can get pretty much your group out of any problem you can possibly think of. And if you've ever watched XP to level 3, Jacob makes some really good videos that sort of highlight some of the issues that the wizard spells present, or some of the spells they have access present. Okay? Alright, so what about the Order of the Scribes? This is very powerful. The Order of the Scribes, when I was looking at what it could do, is frightening. I would say this is now the best wizard to play. The best wizard subclass, hands down, is the Order of the Scribes. How did that happen? Did we really need to make something even more powerful? And apparently they have. I can see a lot of people wanting to play Order of the Scribes. Totally understand that. See, that's definitely going to happen. All of the wizards are getting better, because you can now swap out cantrips. Now, if you had a understanding dungeon master, that was never really an issue, because they would allow you to do that anyway, so that's all good, okay? I actually don't think that being allowed to swap out a cantrip because you're not finding it useful at later levels of play is a bad thing. I actually think that dungeon masters should have allowed that sort of thing to happen from the very get-go, because cantrip, and I know story-wise it doesn't make a lot of sense, but there is a point where some cantrips just don't scale well over time, and they don't really present the kind of benefits that your character might need. And they're on the rare occasions where at high level you run out of spells, which you probably won't. Okay, if you're doing your job properly, you won't run out of spells as a wizard. You'll figure out exactly which spell to use the least number of spells to get the job done. That's what I always did, and I'm sure everybody else does exactly the same thing. But being able to swap out cantrips is really, really useful. So, yeah. Wizards get a big pump, like pretty much everything in this game, apparently. Okay, let's talk about warlocks. I know a lot of people love the warlock, understandable. Warlocks thematically are interesting, mechanically not so exciting for some people, I would imagine. The Genie patron, it is obviously inspired by the TV series I Dream of Genie. Jeremy Crawford has already mentioned that. One of the things I did notice is this extra dimensional vessel that you get as a Genie patron. Easily exploitable. You could easily exploit that particular feature in your game, which I'm sure people will. As an idea and something that you would present in the game, I actually like it, but I would, as a dungeon master, much prefer to present that as an opportunity for the party to use rather than a specific character built into their character class or subclass in this case, which it's built into the subclass, getting this extra dimensional vessel. It also makes sense, but yeah, it's going to be a little bit OP, and I'm sure there are going to be a huge number of Reddit posts and community posts on how to use it in rather interesting ways. And no doubt, given enough time, I will probably do a video explaining how to abuse it in the most appalling manner, because I've already come up with a few things that I thought you could do with it, but I won't talk about them just yet. Okay, we'll leave that for another time because I feel like that's another topic. Then access to the wish spell. I know a lot of people were worried about the Genie patron getting access to wish, but it's in line with when the wizard gets access to the wish spell. So it's really more powerful than the wizard. Is it more powerful than a warlock would normally be able to do? Yeah. But a lot of people never really played the warlock at high levels and really just dipped into it a couple of levels in warlock and went into something else. So fair enough. Give the warlock something else. Get a few more people playing it. Maybe a few more people will play something other than a hexblade, which is not a bad thing. And I think that the hexblade is probably still the best warlock out there. Okay, the fathomless. I was looking at this and I thought, wow, this is really odd. You can summon tentacles, and these tentacles really power all of your features, pretty much. It's an odd one. I didn't really know what to make of it. But then there's a lot of things in this book I could not really get my head around. Both of them, both the Genie Patron and the Fathomless, they're very good subclasses. And on top of that, the Warlock gets an expanded spell list. And when you expand the Warlock spell list, or any caster's spell list, that's a good thing for that class. That certainly makes it more powerful. It's going to mean that these two could potentially wind up being the go-tos for a lot of people. But I think the Genie Patron is going to be the one that a lot of people are going to wind up finding their Dungeon Masters ban. I can see that getting banned. Maybe you can't ban it if you're playing Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League, but if you're at a home game, that might get banned. And then you'll have to do a whole lot of juggling to try to convince your Dungeon Master that you haven't upset the balance and order of the world in some way. Okay, let's talk about the Sorcerer. The Aberrant Mind Sorcerer, very powerful. Very, very powerful. Features like being able to fly, and I know it's a limited version of fly, and then subtle spells, but the fly aspect, there's no concentration. It's not like the flying spell that has concentration. No, you just fly. Okay. And obviously not as fast. It's not 60 feet, but, it doesn't matter. Given enough rounds, you can fly high enough to be out of reach, and that's really what you want. Subtle spell makes the Aberrant easily the best sorcerer out there. By far, the best sorcerer out there. Because being able to eliminate things like hand gestures and speaking, which is what subtle does, duplicating that, really changes the ball game. You can now cast a spell and nobody will be aware that you're casting a spell on them, which is one of the problems you had when you were casting spells around trying to charm somebody, deceive somebody, trick somebody. You can't give away those cues by using hand gestures and speaking, which is what the Dungeon Master in the past would have probably been focusing on. So, the Aberrant Mind. If you were worried about the Sorcerer not being good enough, you don't need to worry about it because the Aberrant Mind now exists. The Clockwork Soul is generally junk mechanics that are situational and will bog down the game. I really did not like this particular subclass. The Clockwork Soul has nothing to do. It doesn't speak to clockwork really at all. It's just a big mess. I know people will like it because, you know, having a homunculus servant would be cool, but it doesn't, you know, a lot of the class features don't really speak to clockwork. They're just mechanics. They're just out there for some reason. So I didn't like this class or subclass at all. Both subclasses get an expanded spell list, and that now dwarfs all, okay, all of the other sorcerers, because when you expand the spell list for a sorcerer, since sorcerers get so few access to so few different spells, that makes a huge difference, and they get some pretty good ones. Not all of them are great, but they get some pretty good ones. So I can see this being really interesting in terms of, okay, what are you playing today? Oh, it's Aberrant Mind or the Clockwork Soul, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, I'm sure there'll be people who will still try to play the dragon one, okay, because it's a good option. You know, that particular sorcerer is a good option. It won't make the Storm Sorcerer any better, but you know, we can't solve everything, right? Storm Sorcerers, they're still going to be pretty rubbish. Okay, what about the Rogue? Oh my gosh. When I thought about the Rogue and why do you need to make the Rogue even... Why do you need to fiddle with that? Okay, why would you need to adjust this? So the first one is the Phantom's features are nonsensical. The Phantom Rogue is really strange. A lot of their features don't make any sense. And then I looked at one of their features. Now, granted, you don't necessarily get them straight off the bat, some of the features here. But one of them basically destroys dungeon exploration completely by being, you can now walk through a wall or a door. Yes, you might take damage, but who cares? Because now you can scope out the location and you can stay in the wall or the door so that nobody can actually hurt, do any significant damage to you. Because the damage you do, you take when you stay in a wall or a door isn't really that much at higher levels. It's not a big deal, okay? But it will absolutely obliterate dungeon exploration, just as Arcane Eye can obliterate dungeon exploration, just as the Imp can be used to scout out a dungeon location and really circumvent everything and give the players information on everything. So if you wanted that kind of power and that kind of utility in your game, you've now got it with the Phantom. The Phantom Rogue can do that. Whispers of the Dead is absolutely open to abuse. It's also extremely strange. It's a very, very strange ability. But I would abuse it. If I had Whispers of the Dead, I'd definitely be using it a lot and abuse it as much as I possibly could. But that's not the most powerful rogue, I would say, that I've seen in this book. The Soul Knife. The Soul Knife, would you believe it, is like a combat monster. It's bat crazy overpowered. So if you go and have a look at all the documents I've put down in the description that talk about all of the subclasses, and you look at the final rendition of the Soul Knife, it is crazy overpowered. It is now a sneaking expert. It is a sneaking machine. Okay, on a scale that is mad for infiltration. You'll be able to do pretty much anything and nobody's ever going to be able to find you. Do it right and you'll do a great job. Both rogues are very strong. The Soul Knife is probably the absolute best rogue out there. Even the Assassin will probably have trouble keeping up with the Soul Knife. can you imagine being able to form a magical weapon that can never be stolen, and you can do a lot with it? So the Soul Knife, for me, is the win for the Rogue. And it is completely obvious when you have a look at what they have leaked on the internet about the Soul Knife in its final form. Okay, I love rogues, not so much, but I actually love the Ranger. I know a lot of people hit the Ranger and say it's a very weak class and it's not any good, but I like Rangers. I think they're really good in a wilderness exploration campaign. I think they have a lot of features that aren't combat and are more about sort of exploration and other aspects of playing the game, which I actually like. You know, I would like to see things that are always on, that don't sort of use an action or a bonus action or a reaction or something like this, and aren't linked to actions or anything like that, which are always working, okay? The Fey Wanderer is not exciting, but it's a reasonable option that also gets an expanded spell list. So when you expand the spell list for Rangers, that's useful, but they are only a half caster, so they don't really get spells till a little bit later on, and you know, you don't get a lot. The Ranger that I thought was rather unique is the Swarmkeeper. The Swarmkeeper is unique, and it's really odd. It's a very strange idea. It is definitely stronger than the player's handbook options that you have. You can fly, and you get an expanded spell list again. And on top of that, I can see Sage Advice will have to field questions on the swarm moving your character around the battlefield, because that's what you can do with your swarm. Okay, you can literally have it shift and move your character. So how does that interact with something like opportunity attacks? You know, when you move out of somebody's threatened space, I mean, are you deciding to move out of that location because the swarm is sort of part of you and you, or is it forced movement? Because if it's forced movement, we're looking at some applications that are easily abusable, if that's what you wanted. And certainly I think it could be used like that, and you're probably going to get a lot of people asking questions, a lot of confusion. What the Swarmkeeper reminds me of is a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons 4E mechanics that were present when that game was put out, where you could do something and you could move around the battlefield more. A lot of people complain about Dungeons and Dragons 5e not allowing for movement on the battlefield, and this ability that the Swarmkeeper has is going to make that possible now. You can actually move around the battlefield, which is kind of cool, without walking. Who needs to walk? Hey, who needs to fly? Well, it doesn't matter, because chances are you'll have a bunch of subclasses that can fly anyway, and the Swarmkeeper can fly. So why not? Cool, let's do that. There have been slight improvements to the Beastmaster. For those of you who are wondering, what are we going to do with the Beastmaster? Is there any improvements? Yes, there has been a slight improvement. It's a bit easier to get your beast back. Although I don't think it's really a beast now. I feel like it's more a spirit animal rather than a companion beast. For those of you who are wondering sort of how that works, just because of how you get it back, you can just use a spell slot, you know. Sweet. Cool. I lost it. Spell slot. It's back. Same one as before. But it does feel very much like a spirit animal companion rather than a beast companion now. And there have been other adjustments and changes to the Ranger, which have improved them. So if you are concerned and thought, well, you know, there's no point playing those because they're no good, and who needs to worry about dealing with those sorts of issues because I could play something else and I have a far better time. Well, you can be assured a lot of the leaked information in the Google document does indicate that there are going to be vast improvement on the Ranger. So happy days for those of you who love playing Ranger. Okay, let's talk about the Paladin. By far, I would say the Paladin is one of the stronger classes out there. Not a lot of information leaked on the Paladin. But if you look at what is there, and it's not much. It's pretty sparse. I wouldn't say you're getting much out of this in terms of the Paladin. The Oath of Glory is a reprint from the Theros book, the new book that came out. It's comparable with the Player's Handbook. So the Oath of Glory is this nothing sort of pops out and says, oh, okay, this is better. This is more interesting. The Oath of Glory, it's all right. The Oath of the Watchers is comparable with the Player's Handbook, in my opinion. But I will say this, and there's one feature with the Order of the Watcher that the Paladin has that I would be concerned about. And it's probably the one that stood out the most for me, because I just thought about how often you would use it, how useful it would be, and how amazing it is in terms of buffing up your party. And that is the Aura of the Sentinel, which is very, very powerful. Can you imagine being able to improve your chances of success with your initiative roll? It's bizarre that it's an action to use it, because usually there aren't actions outside of the initiative roll. You know, that's the very first thing you roll. Usually you might have a stealth check before you have an initiative roll. That's certainly possible. You might have a perception check before a initiative roll. But I can see this. You can now impart this ability onto members in your party as well, to a certain degree. That means that other people in your group, their initiative is going to get better. This changes things a lot. Just imagine if you combine that with something like the alert feat. Okay, if you put that with the alert feat, whoa, oh my gosh. There's not too many things that are going to get to go first. As a dungeon master, the chances are your monsters are going last. If you've got somebody who has got a Oath of the Watchers with the Aura of the Sentinel, most of the party are going to probably roll much higher than you on initiative as a result of that feature. Okay, just to let you know. And I know you can only use it, I know people say that, but there are limitations. So the limitation's probably not going to be enough, not really. But there's not much more else to say about the options for the Paladin as far as I'm concerned. Okay, they're all pretty much what we already know about. Okay, so what about the Monk? I love playing monks. I think they are fantastic. I have a lot of fun playing monks. I know a lot of people don't like monks because they think they're underpowered. They don't do their job properly. But actually, monks do their job pretty well. What about the changes that we're going to see with the monk? Way of the Mercy. I don't know much about what's going on with the Way of the Mercy. Frankly, I could not find very much at all. What I was concerned about was the Way of the Astral Self. It is hands down the best monk in the game now. What you can do with your Astral Self at low level and at higher level, it's full of Dungeons & Dragons 4E mechanics as far as I'm concerned. And it's really broken. I can see it being easily abused. So if people were saying, don't play a monk because they're no good. Well, Way of the Astral Self is a definitely viable option now because it's a lot better. So you're going to have a lot of fun using your Astral Self to make attacks. You can extend your range. You can make attacks that essentially, well, monks always could make magical attacks, but now at a lower level, instead of, I think it's level 5 normally you get your magical attack with a monk. Well, now I think it's like level 3, so much lower level than it was before, so you don't have to wait quite so long, which is kind of useful, right? And then on top of that, not just reach increase and not just magical attacks a bit sooner, but what do you do with somebody who is trying to attack you? You don't have to be quite so close. So yeah, and even the damage output on it is pretty nuts. I think that if you wanted to slag the monk, you're wasting your time now, because the Way of the Astral Self is the go-to for your monk. All right, let's talk about the fighter. There really isn't much. I could not find very much leaked about the fighter. There's a lot of information you will find on D&D Beyond, talking thematically about some of the things you can do with these classes or subclasses. The Psi Warrior still pretty unknown to me. I couldn't really find anything on it. Okay, so I can't tell you anything much about that. The Rune Knight has missing mechanics. So I found some of the information on it, but it's really hard to establish how it will affect the game until you know all of its features. And since there was missing information and I couldn't find everything, I didn't really want to say anything about something I didn't fully know the information on. It seemed reasonable to just leave that alone. So I'm not going to say whether they're good or bad, because frankly I don't know what's happening with the fighter, because that information is probably sitting on those illegal PDFs that are on really dodgy sites. But I don't recommend going there, because you'll probably wind up with a virus, and we don't want that happening. Okay. Next, what about something like the Druid? I don't really play Druids very often. But let's talk about the Druid in terms of the Circle of Spores, already reprinted from Ravnica. The Ravnica book had the Circle of Spores. The Circle of Wildfire is really odd, as this Druid actually burns stuff. Okay, it's average power. I mean, I would say its power output is average, but it's a Druid that burns stuff. And what I mean, I understand this is kind of the concept is very North American, where fire is a cleansing force, and by burning stuff you're actually helping the forest grow and stuff like that. Maybe that's what's going on here. I don't know. A lot of people are really upset because guess what? No fireball in the wildfire option. Yes, the Druid, the Circle of Wildfire, you do not get fireball. I know a lot of people are really annoyed. Let's get real. Fireball is pretty destructive. And if you could throw that around, because that's what wizards do, right? They throw out fireball all the time. It's pretty destructive. So I can kind of understand why they got rid of it. But if you're going to call a subclass Wildfire, it doesn't really make sense to limit the kinds of fire spells you can have access to. I can also see the Wildfire Druid easily annoying people with their class features. I can see that happening for sure, because it's I mean, solving problems with fire is usually the realm of the 14-year-old player. When I think about how old I was and how I solve problems, it's a very sort of basic way of solving issues. If you can't figure out how to deal with the situation, burn it with fire. That's often the solution, and that's what the Circle of Wildfire is sort of catering to. Okay, what about the Circle of Stars? It has an overly powerful features. Okay, the Circle of Stars has overly powered features, and you will use them often. You can use them often. There is so much there that you can use. It is absolutely rife. It's for the picking. If you wanted to pick and pluck for multi-classing, the Circle of Stars is it. Okay, go there and you can get some really good stuff. And you'll use it a lot, and they're really powerful. A bit strange to be able to turn into stars. When I read that and I was thinking, what, you can turn into stars? How do I deal with that? How does that interact if somebody tries to attack you? Well, not in a way that makes any sense, really, because frankly, it was easier when you had to deal with a Druid that turned into a beast or an animal. But now you're going to be able to turn into stars. So there are combat and utility benefits galore. Stuff you will love, okay? It's absolutely rife with stuff for the Druid. And I know a lot of people don't like Druids, but mate, this looks really, really fun. Gonna make your dungeon master's head pop right off, and you can just sort of sit there and stroke yourself and how clever you were and being able to select that class. Okay, what about the Cleric? The Order domain is a reprint from Ravnica, so it's already out there. We already know what it is. The Peace domain, when I looked at that, the Peace domain was literally called the Love domain originally. And I think it's now, let's call it the politically correct subclass that's overly powerful, okay? So the peace domain. So there's a feature that the peace domain has. And if I was a player and I was using this cleric, and I like clerics too, I would spam it like big time. And that's emboldening bond. expect your players, if they use the peace domain and they have emboldening bond, which they will, they'll be able to spam that thing as much as they can, because there's really no limitation on how much you can use it. And it's really good. It's really, really good. So yeah, have a lot of fun. Try not to lose your nut too much at your players when they start using it, but that's definitely going to happen. You can expect it for sure. The Twilight Domain, insanely good as well, and it gets an expanded spell list. The Eyes of the Night is crazy. So the Eyes of the Night, if I remember right, basically it's dark vision to 300 feet. It was originally infinite, but they decided that they needed to scale down Eyes of the Night so that essentially your ability to see at night isn't going to be infinite. That's just ridiculous. So let's just make it 300 feet. I read that and I was like, what were they thinking? You know, that pretty much solves all your issues in terms of seeing at night. It doesn't matter whether it's 300 feet or it's infinite, it's pretty much the same as far as I'm concerned. And this feature you can actually apply to other party members. Not quite in the same way, but to other party members. So yeah, I think the Twilight Domain is going to be the go-to for a cleric. Pretty easy. The Peace and Twilight Domain are front-loaded, so expect your players to multi-class with them a lot. I think that is a given. That's going to be the case with a lot of these subclasses, but a lot of their features are spammable. They're not, like one use. You can keep using them over and over again, and they're really useful too. So I can see people picking these up, and all changed, game changer. And we all know that being able to see in the dark is actually a game changer compared to somebody who needs to carry a torch to be able to see. You might not have perfect sight and darkness with dark vision, but it's better than not being able to see anything, and you're not giving away your location by carrying around lanterns and torches and candles. So I can see that being easily exploitable in your game as well. Okay, we're getting closer to the end. Oh, thank God for that. What about the Bard? The College of Eloquence is a reprint from the Theros book. It is by far the best Bard out there. As far as I can tell, it is absolutely unbelievable. So if you're a Bard player and somebody was giving you a hard time about playing a Bard, that College of Eloquence that was reprinted from Theros, it's now in here. Makes playing in Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League, it's a no-brainer. If you're only going to get 2 books, then you're going to be going with the Player's Handbook, and, because you've got to have the Player's Handbook, and the other book is going to be Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Yeah, absolutely. The College of Creation is a bit unknown to me. Its final form I haven't seen. Okay, so I couldn't make an assessment, and I actually spent a lot of time with a friend of mine called Simon. I won't say anything more than his name is Simon. He knows a lot more about how classes will interact together, which is where I'm getting a lot of my analysis from. You know, we sat down for hours. I think it was 5-6 hours working our way through everything, trying to work out what was likely to happen with these classes. And yeah, by all means, you can have a different opinion, but the College of Eloquence, I think, is hands down the best Bard. Okay, so I don't have anything more to say other than, yep, if you want to play a Bard, College of Eloquence. Next, the Barbarian. The Barbarian has a class in here which I can't believe they actually made. I really can't believe they did it. Apparently they thought it was a good idea, and considering the amount of time that the Dungeons & Dragons design team has spent, the whole franchise has been tippy-toeing around being, politically correct, socially appropriate, integrating everybody, integrating men, women, everybody of every race, or of any kind of sexual preference, all that sort of stuff, and they put this thing in here. This just, I can't understand. So the Path of Wild Magic is strange. It's a mixed bag of features in terms of good, bad. It has a breast laser. Literally, you have a feature that shoots out radiant energy from your chest. Now, who is not going to find that inappropriate or bonkers? I thought it was bonkers. The class itself is broken at lower levels, but when I saw this, I was thinking, so what are people going to do? They're probably going to play a female character and have breast lasers and find it very, very, very amusing. And it'll be highly offensive to the opposite sex. I don't think women are going to find it even remotely funny. I think they are going to just go bananas. But if you're a teenager or a man who finds that sort of thing entertaining and wants to see people squirm and just wants to make a mockery of things and do something that's a bit outrageous, that is absolutely going to happen. You're definitely going to have somebody who's going to have a breast laser, and not only does it have breast laser that causes radiant damage, it blinds you. it actually blinds you so you can't see. It is definitely Austin Powers like in its nature. I could not believe that. So please expect on Twitter, Facebook, social media, a response to this particular feature that will probably wind up with it getting errated or changed or modified in some way, because it is pretty mad. And for those of you who are thinking, ooh, isn't that what Iron Man does? Yes, you're completely right. That's exactly what it is. It's very Iron Man-like. But it doesn't have to come out of a piece of armor. It can just come out of your chest. Okay, so that's really strange. Okay, the other thing is the random table that they get for their wild magic is very small, so it doesn't have a lot of things that it does, and it doesn't scale very well with the character as it advances. It's not going to scale well at all. So I don't really know what to say about this. It is the kind of class you play to get a reaction from somebody. I think that's really what people are going to be doing with this. And yes, you could say, yes, they're trying to be Iron Man, but yeah, are they really? Because barbarians don't actually have to wear armor. Okay? So, yes. Okay, so next, Path of the Beast. The final form for that particular subclass is unknown to me. I really couldn't find very much on it. And I think you're going to get more information later on as time goes by. We've still got quite a few days before the book is finally officially released, rather than, released in other dubious manners. But I think that we'll get more information on that. But I did not find very much information on that particular topic, unfortunately, for those of you who really wanted something. Okay, the last class. So the artificer is, and all its subclasses, I understand, are reprinted. They're reprinted in this book. It's an insanely complex class to play. It really is complicated. Not only that, really to play it effectively, you'll need to have a Dungeon Master's Guide. Why? Because you're going to try to make magic items. And where are all the magic items? They're in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And really there aren't too many resources that are free that allow you access to the information on magic items, unless you find a phone app or something like that with a small fee that allows you access to that sort of information, who probably will get taken down if they stay up for too long and Wizards of the Coast spots them without paying some sort of licensing fee. So I don't like the Artificer for that fact. It should have stayed in Eberron. I think that the Artificer really should have stayed in the Eberron setting as a specialty class rather than transporting it into every setting. And they have already said that all of the classes and subclasses are not setting specific. So the idea is that all of these subclasses and all of these classes are accessible to every setting and every homebrew world that you might create. That's really what they're trying to do, but it's also, for those of you who are like, no, I can restrict that in my home game, of course you can. But it's tailored for Adventurers League. That's really what's going on here. It's to ensure that the Adventurers League play can use everything that is available now, and that it's not setting specific, where there used to be some restrictions in that case. I don't like the idea of making magic items. That's always going to cause problems for me. I think that Trent Monk has classified the artificer as the worst class to play. I am still not happy about it having any kind of presence in my own game, because I would still prefer it to stay in a setting like Eberron, where it makes more sense, where making magic items, you know, is something that would happen. But there are a lot of people who want to play that artificer and don't want to have to worry about playing in an Eberron setting, and they want to be able to play it in the Forgotten Realms, and that's what's driving all of this right now. Clearly, for Dungeons and Dragons Adventurers League players desiring to access it, and people interested in creating magic items, and I don't really fall in line with that way of thinking. I think that making magic items, even a small amount of them, is not necessarily a good thing to do. Okay, so there's been a lot of information I have presented today. Okay, I can assure you I will never do a video like this again, because I would have to be on holiday. If I was working, I could not have researched this and done all this. I could not have pulled it off. It wouldn't have happened. But if you like this, great. I have hundreds of videos for players and dungeon masters that aren't bat crazy. Some of them are, but most of them aren't, that you will probably find really useful if you're a dungeon master or a player, and you're welcome to go and check those out. And some of them are quite creative, so you'll be surprised. If you want to support the channel so I keep doing video content like this, you can through my Patreon page. I have affiliate links to Amazon down in the description. I have a merchandise shelf underneath my videos you're welcome to go and check out as well. Or just watch my videos. You know, if you watch my videos, that's actually good for me too. If you don't forget to share, like, and subscribe, hit the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos. And hey, till next time, heads up, keep rolling those 20s.